Hey everyone, DB here from Eat Sleep Cruise, and this week we're doing something a little different. A few weeks ago, I was able to sit down with author Paul Thornton to talk about his latest book about cruising, Cruising Interrupted. Now, if you're not familiar with Paul's work, this is actually his second book about cruising, the follow-up to 2019's Joy of Cruising. In his latest book, Paul features 25 avid cruisers. And yes, spoiler warning, Heidi and I are included in that set. In this interview, Paul and I talk about how he began writing about cruise ships, his passion for cruising, and we preview several of the profiles featured in the book. Cruising Interrupted is available on Amazon as an ebook or in paperback, or head over to cruisinginterrupted.com and use the coupon code WeWillBeBack to save 30% off the list price. Now, before we jump into the interview, make sure in the comment section below to leave some questions for Paul, and we might just be able to get him back on the channel to answer them for you.
So the reason I wrote another book was I love the process of writing the first book. So early on in the process of writing that book, I knew I wanted to write another book. I didn't know about what, but I liked writing. And so shortly after I published the first book, I cruise about once a year. It's a great way to bond with your grandchildren. And so I take my grandkids on a cruise every summer. And so just in the process of doing consumer research about cruises, I would go to the discussion boards and the Facebook groups. And Don, what I found was I was more interested in some of the stories shared by cruisers than I was in, doing just consumer research, put out by the cruise lines. And the more I read about cruises, the more I came to the realization, I think there's a story here. And so that kind of led me to writing this compendium of stories about passionate cruisers. One of the things that went through my mind as I profiled these various people, the word vicarious, living vicariously through them. And so that's what fascinated. I wanted to hear their stories, because I wanted to live their stories, and I couldn't for a variety of reasons. I can't cruise 21 times in a year. But I'd like to hear what that's like, and I'd like to maybe strive to be able to do that someday. It is viewing cruising through others, and that's why it's a great book for people who maybe aspire to take a cruise and have never taken a cruise.
For folks who don't know, the first book is The Joy of Cruising, right? That's available on Amazon and wherever you can get books on there. And this book we're going to talk about next, Cruising Interrupted, is kind of a follow-up sequel, but it went in a different route, of course, because you mentioned the pandemic. So before talking about that, what are some things you learned from writing The Joy of Cruising that kind of inspired you to say, well, there's even more stories to tell?
Well, a couple of things I learned. Well, first of all, the reason I wrote the second book was because the first book was such a blast. It was so much fun. Again, to use that word, living vicariously through cruisers, I wanted to do that again. I wanted to do some more of that. But I did learn a couple of things, and that I wanted to explore further in the second book. For instance, my cruising, I learned that my cruising over the years is just the tip of the iceberg. They've all been to the Bahamas, the Caribbean, big mainstream lines. I did a lot of cruising on Carnival when my daughters were growing up, because Carnival is kind of a family cruise line. It's kind of affordable, and so we did a lot of Carnival cruising. What I learned was, there's the Mediterranean, Alaska. I knew nothing about river cruising and expedition cruising and specialty cruising. theme cruising. So I just learned that there's a whole lot to cruising that I didn't know, even though I cruise more than, say, your average American, but although not a whole lot. And so in the second book, I do a lot more exploration of things like small ship cruising. In fact, I have a whole section called Quirky and Fun, and it features one company called Quirky Cruises, which is sort of they are the trip advisor, if you will, of the small ship cruising world. And then I also I have some coverage of expedition cruising in there. I've added to my bucket list, as a result of writing the second book, a cruise in Vietnam, a river cruise in Vietnam. That's something that 8 months ago would not have been anywhere on my radar.
But you would say that compared to joy of cruising, you're trying to broaden what the term cruising is. That's one thing we tell people a lot too, is that people have this misconception about cruising. And I say there's a cruise for everybody, right? There's so many different styles of ships, locations, and things you can actually do on a cruise.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and another slight change. I tended to transcend cruising a little bit. So I covered more of just travel in general. For instance, I have a section called the Globetrotters, and it features three people who are pretty renowned in travel beyond cruising, although they have great cruising stories and great cruising angles. And so I have a feature on a gentleman, it's called Ask Chef Dennis. So, his background, he's a chef, and his background is, he's known in the culinary world. And so, he's probably bigger in the world of general travel and culinary than he is in cruising. But I cover sort of his cruising, the cruising aspects of his story. So I try to be a little bit more general, get a little bit away from just solely big ship cruising. And I had a section called Cruise Communicators. So, one talks about the spoken word. So, I have somebody who's big in the area of podcasts, and then one features on the visual imagery. And so then I have a feature on someone who's big on YouTube. And then another is on the written word. So I have a feature on Aaron Foster, who is the author of The Unofficial Guide to the Disney Cruise Line. Mm-hmm. So that's the Cruise Communicators section. So it's just different sections covering different aspects of cruising. The section you're in means an awful lot to me. It's called Bloggers, Cruise Community Champions. And I explained in the book why I call you guys Cruise Community Champions. And I'm not going to cover that here. But the reason I say it meant a whole lot to me, and maybe I'm getting ahead of you, and you might talk about Cruising Interrupted, but I started writing the second book, and it wasn't called Cruising Interrupted. It was actually called More Joy of Cruising. And then the pandemic happened, and for a variety of reasons, I went into a pretty deep funk and stopped writing, and I restarted. I would follow the bloggers, people like Eat Sleep Cruise and others, and you guys, lifted my spirits. I use the corny phrase in the book. You kept the spirits of the cruise community afloat, if you will, and as bad as things have been for passionate cruisers, you guys have been. I don't know what the right, a breath of fresh air. And so that was a very, very important section to me.
Obviously, you mentioned some of the things we were posting kind of to your spirits. What ultimately got you saying, hey, I want to start writing again and get back to these people and just maybe shift the angle or change a little bit about what the second book's going to be about?
Well, when I stopped writing, uh, I didn't stop my passion for cruising. So I would still do my everyday visits to the discussion forums and to the Facebook cruise groups and to the blogs and the podcasts. So I still, had a lot of interest in cruising, but it just didn't feel right writing about it. And what I found, Don, when I would go to those various sites, uh, the overwhelming sentiment was wishful thinking. I mean, this was let's say in April of 20, I would go to those sites and people would be talking about cruises that they had booked for June, and they were talking like they were going to happen. Now, I didn't know, but I felt strongly that they weren't going to happen.
We were some of those people. We thought that, total disclosure, we were like, this will be done by May.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, looking back, how maybe it's just optimistic or foolish, but no, right. I'm sorry. But we were some of those people like, well, we went on a cruise literally in March. Folks who know, of course, follow us. We were on a cruise, as you detail in the book, and they literally had the official, we're closing everything down it was March 13th or March. We were supposed to come back, and then our cruise was delayed because they wouldn't let us dock. And we were like, well, by May, this will be fine.
Yeah. And those kinds of thoughts, I would say to myself, well, maybe maybe it's not that bad, So anyway, consumers were thinking like this was going to correct itself soon, and people like yourself, bloggers and content providers, were doing creative things, fun things, virtual cocktail parties and things like that. And so those things kind of combined to lift my spirits. But anyway, I dug myself out of that, and I decided I wanted to restart the writing. However, I knew that I had to be mindful of what was happening in the world, and so almost every chapter of the book at least has a mention of COVID-19. The book is still fun and upbeat, uh, uh, but it doesn't ignore the fact that the industry has been besieged by the biggest event to affect cruising, I guess, since the sinking of the Titanic. And so I incorporated as much as I could of COVID into the book without being too much of a downer. And when I say I incorporated, I have a couple of real stories. People who were on the ocean when the pandemic was declared. You were on the ocean when the pandemic was declared, but your situation was relatively normal. I think your cruise was extended by a day or something like that.
2 days, yeah.
Yeah, but I interviewed other people who had deaths on this ship, and so I found a way to talk about those real things in the book, and yet the book retains, or at least I try to retain, sort of the fun, upbeat spirit. But that's a challenge. You have to strike a balance, and I'll leave it to others, and I'll read the reviews to see how successful I was in doing that. But I try to strike that balance.
Having talked to all these people now between both books, you're talked to dozens of people, from everyday people to professional travelers. Like, what are some of the similarities or differences you see in these folks that love to cruise?
Let me say something about similarities. One learning I had, and I don't know why this was such a revelation to me, why it was a learning to me, but I remember when I set out to write Joy of Cruising, and I was actually going to have a section in the book called because I had gotten, quite a few people who were interested in being in it from the UK. I was going to have a section called UK Cruising. And I ultimately didn't do that because, in terms of similarities, cruises are the same no matter where they are. They have the same joys and the same likes and dislikes in UK as they do in the US. A few different lines. I learned a lot about lines I had never heard of, P&O and Azamara and things like that. But they also have the lines that that we're used to and that I'm used to in the U.S. Royal Caribbean and Carnival and all that abroad as well. So obviously I didn't have a section called UK Cruising because there's no difference between UK cruises and US cruises. Now I do have a lot of UK cruises in both books. So the similarities, our cruises are kind of the same no matter where they're from. But in terms of differences, as I alluded to earlier, I learned that cruising is very, very diverse. And so, you have some people who they wouldn't be caught on a big ship. They just have no desire to be on a big ship. And then others who, it would be really hard to convince them to take a river cruise, I suspect. So, what I've learned in terms of differences is that there's just a lot of diversity out there in terms of cruising. Some people like, luxury cruising, and then there's small ship cruising. Theme cruising. Now, theme cruising is something that's very interesting because everybody on the cruise, they're not only passionate about cruising, but they're passionate about whatever the theme is. So if it's a country western cruise, well, they're passionate about country western. If it's a cooking cruise, and they're passionate about, the culinary arts. So the difference is there are too many differences to enumerate. Cruising can appeal to all kinds of cruisers, and there's a cruise to meet every need.
Yeah, I know. Like I said earlier, that's kind of one thing we always say. If someone says, "Oh, I don't really like cruising," or "I would never go on one of those ships," I'm like, "Well, I'll get to know. If I don't know you that well, I'll get to know you a little bit, and I can find the best cruise or best ship for you." Social media, remind me, it's at Joy of Cruising. I know that's on Twitter. Is that also on Instagram and Facebook as well?
Yes, and the website for the new book is cruisinginterrupted.com. And for the Joy of Cruising, it's thejoyofcruising.net. And also, if you want to get free shipping, use the coupon code We Will Be Back, and that will get you down to the same price that you can get it for on Amazon. So.
I lied. One more question. Is there going to be a third book, you thinking? Or are you going to take a little break, or are we going to pivot and write about something else?
Well, there never was an intention to have a series on cruising. But also, no one ever guessed that we would have a pandemic. And so, it's almost a foregone conclusion that there'll be a third book. Cruising's the rebirth of cruising, the return of cruising. I'm going to have to chronicle that.